Well, Jim, thank you so much for a very kind introduction. Chuck, thank you. And thanks to all of you for giving the precious gift of your time and being here today. Is it great to be back in 3 dimensions again? Or what? I think a lot of us are zoomed out from the last year and a half plus, and it is such a privilege for me to be here and to be the first in-person speaker in about 20 months at this wonderful organization, the Santa Fe Council on International Relations. And I'm really honored to be here, Jim. Thank you so much for the gracious invitation and all the warm hospitality. It is an incredible place. I think I'm one of the few Texans that had not yet been to Santa Fe. But you will see me again because this is an incredible place. It is the city different, and I have been stunned by the beauty and the warmth of the people and the vibrancy and energy of this community. We meet at an interesting time in the U.S.-China relationship. I think I could say that sentence on any day of the last 10 or 15 years, and it would also have been true. But we are in an interesting moment. I think the topic today of U.S.-China relations and what's at stake, and where is the relationship, where is it going, and what does it mean for America and for the world, is a very resonant topic, and one that, frankly, we could spend a lot of time and a few graduate courses going through in great detail, but I'll try to be uncharacteristically brief today by limiting my comments to about 25 or 30 minutes, and I have a feeling I'll get a few good reminders from my good friend Jim if I start to go too long over that. I just want to say, judging from the size of the audience, it's wonderful to see such a great crowd here. It's evident to me that my reputation did not precede me, and that's why we have such a great turnout. That being said, let me get into the topic. There's a lot to say, but what I really want to do is basically to talk a little bit about where the relationship is now by way of setting the scene and setting the backdrop for this discussion and for what will be the most interesting part of the discussion, which is the questions and the comments that you will have and the discussion that we'll have together. But kind of saying, where are we right now in the relationship? And then on that basis, to say a little bit about the sources of both continuity and change as we transition from the Trump administration to the Biden administration, which has now been in office just over 9 months. And there are elements of continuity in U.S. policy toward China that we can see very clearly. There are also some elements of change, and I want to talk about those partly because they're a little less visible and evident than the sources of and elements of continuity. And then on that basis, I want to just say a few words about what I regard as the 7 big issues in the U.S.-China relationship that are really at the epicenter of all the contentiousness and stress and disagreement and really turbulence in the relationship that we have today. I think if you boil it down, the bottom line is there's about 7 issues that are very profound issues, and I'll say a little bit more about this in a bit, for the most part are largely irreconcilable issues in the relationship, and they create some structural turbulence that's going to be with us for a long time. So that's what I want to do. When I conclude, we'll have breakfast in the morning because I think it's going to take about that long to get through that realistically, but I will try to give you the short version. Let me start by just saying, where are we right now in the relationship? Bottom line, we're in a very difficult and strained place. U.S.-China relations are today nearly 50 years after the Nixon visit of 1972 and almost exactly 50 years after the Kissinger visit that set up that visit, which Kissinger's visit was in the summer of 71. We're kind of at the 50-year mark of the United States starting to re-engage China. And we are at the low water mark since that time of the U.S.-China relationship in the modern era. By pretty much any metric that you would want to use and that would be meaningful, this relationship is more challenged and more strained today than it has been in the last 50 years. The rhetoric has been tough. The tonality has been harsh, in some cases kind of over the top, certainly on our side, and a number of cases on the Chinese side. There's been very little progress on almost any issue on the bilateral agenda. And the level of trust, I think, is truly at an all-time low subsequent to the 1970s. I would say we trusted each other more in 1974 than we do in the year 2021, just to be specific about it. And it's arguably going down even from where we are now. So it is in a difficult place. The U.S.-China relationship is in a difficult place, and I think that's a bad thing for the United States. I think it's a bad thing for China. It's certainly a bad thing for the relationship, but even more fundamentally, it's a bad thing for the world. With that being said, let me talk a little bit about, and I'll try to be brief here, a little bit about the sources of both continuity and change as we've transitioned from the preceding administration to the current administration. And I just want to point to 4 elements of continuity and 4 elements of change. And I think they help tell the story of, where we're going in the relationship as viewed through a United States lens. Let me hasten to add something that I often do point out when I do talks, and that is I'm coming at this very consciously from an American perspective, and I'm aware of that. And I'm also very well aware that if a good Chinese friend of mine were to come up and speak about the U.S.-China relationship, or shall we say the China-U.S. relationship from the perspective of a Chinese national, that individual's perspective on a lot of these issues would be very different. As a matter of fact, that individual's perspective as to what issues are legitimately considered issues in the bilateral relationship would be different, to say nothing of the actual positions on the issues. So I know that I'm sharing an American perspective, and I'm cognizant of that, and if a Chinese friend were up here speaking, he or she would speak about these issues in a somewhat different way. That being said, let me share what I see as we've transitioned from the one administration to the other. So first, the sources of continuity. The Trump administration believed that, first of all, whatever it was that the United States was doing relative to our approach to China prior to the Trump administration coming into office was not working. That was the fundamental starting point of the Trump administration as it looked at the issue of China. Whatever it was we were doing, it wasn't working for America. That was the view. That was the view that President Trump, candidate Trump, President Trump, and the Trump administration had. That is also the view that the Biden administration has. So that's source of continuity number one. The Biden administration essentially embraces the Trump administration's fundamental assessment that the old way of doing things, dating back to the Obama administration, George W. Bush, Clinton, George H.W. Bush, Reagan, and others, that those approaches were no longer working, or that they were never working in the first place. So the Biden administration shares that fundamental view. That's the first thing. The second point that I would make in terms of continuity is that if you had to take one word and summarize the basic mindset of the Trump administration with respect to China and what the desired end state was, the word would be reciprocity. Reciprocity was the principal theme, and I would say the through line of what the United States hoped to achieve relative to China. And to put it more specifically and concretely, think about it in terms of the U.S.-China trade and economic and commercial and investment relationship. The United States wanted to, and still wants to, and I think very appropriately so, have a much greater degree of reciprocity in the trade relationship than we have historically had, and that we currently have even today, even after 3.5 years of the trade war, et cetera, which I'll talk more about briefly in a little bit. So the idea is, of the Trump administration, if they're doing it to us, we're going to do it to them. And in a sense, as I'll maybe elaborate here in a second, the Trump administration was not so concerned as to whether in our mimicking of Chinese actions, whether we were doing things that comported with our own laws, values, norms, and traditional approaches. The basic idea was, you do it to me, I will do it back to you. And that was the idea, so reciprocity. The Biden administration also embraces the idea of reciprocity. There'll be a little distinction here, which I'll talk about when I talk about sources of divergence or change. But the Biden administration basically accepts the premise that we have an asymmetrical relationship, one that lacks reciprocity in important ways, particularly in the trade area. Namely, just to be clear, our markets are much more open to Chinese goods and services than Chinese markets are to US goods and services, and that is certainly true. It's true even today. And so therefore, the Biden administration also believes, yes, let's emphasize reciprocity, let's get to a more reciprocal place in this relationship. That's the second source of continuity. The third source of continuity is the idea that the Trump administration had, which was also central to its overall mindset about China, and that is the idea that China was and is the single most formidable national competitor to the United States that we face. In fact, as I'll point out in a minute, the Trump administration actually went further than that. But at a minimum, the Trump administration framed China as the single most consequential competitor. The Biden administration absolutely embraces that framing. So this is the third point of continuity. The Biden administration regards, and has said that it regards China as the single most consequential and formidable competitor that we face. By the way, I would agree with that assessment. I think China is the single most formidable competitor that we face and that we will face in the lifetimes of every American alive today, including an infant born in Santa Fe today. And so in this regard, too, the Biden administration accepts the basic premise of the Trump administration. Now, mind you, in a number of ways, all of these basic positions or views about China diverged from presidents preceding Donald Trump. So Donald Trump as president and his administration ushered in a very different set of views about China than views that had been held by Presidents Obama, George W. Bush, Clinton, George H.W. Bush, Reagan, and Carter. So all six of those presidents across the partisan aisle saw China essentially the same way. Trump saw China differently in certain important respects, and what I'm saying is that Biden is embracing those differences and diverging from all previous presidents prior to Trump in many ways. The final point, the fourth point of continuity, is in the legislative and regulatory context that exists around China in this country. So during the Trump years, through acts of Congress that in most cases, or I think every case, were signed by the president, and I don't think there was a case of a veto ever being overridden on this set of issues. Congress and the president acted to adopt legislation and sign into law laws that related directly to China and that sought to address some of the perceived challenges that China posed to the United States. And so a number of laws came on the book, actually many laws came on the books that were either directly or indirectly very related to China, including, for example, just to name a couple of specific examples, but there are probably scores that I could name. The Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act, FIRRMA, or FIRMA, which tightened and strengthened the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, or CFIUS process, which is a national security vetting for foreign inbound investment to make sure that there are no negative national security implications. And that was tightened as a direct result of concern about what was regarded by some as, quote, predatory investment on the part of China. And other ones that I could cite, like the Export Control Reform Act and others. Bottom line is that those laws that passed, and also presidential directives, executive orders, and so on, none of those are coming off the books, probably ever. Certainly, in the foreseeable future. So the laws that came on the books, the presidential directives, the executive orders that were issued relative to China, they're here to stay. And that is a source of continuity. In a number of cases, it would be possible, certainly with respect to executive orders, for President Biden to undo an executive order by virtue of his inherent constitutional authority as president. But he's chosen not to do that for whatever set of reasons, and as a result, we see continuity. So those are the main areas where we actually see what I would regard as a kind of carrying on of Trump policies and the Trump administration mindset in the Biden administration, at least 9 months into the administration, and recognizing there's still a long way to go. But where we are today, we see a lot of continuity. Let me speak briefly about the changes that we've seen. In some ways, they're less obvious than the elements of continuity. And so I want to just say a little bit about them, because it would be easy to, and this will sound really weird, and I understand that, with respect to the US approach to China, it would be easy to see the Biden first term as essentially a Trump second term. And it would not be unfair to frame it that way for the most part. But there are some really significant differences, even if they're a little bit more subtle. So a few differences, maybe 5 actually, that I want to go through. And one of them is that whereas it is absolutely true that the Biden administration frames China very explicitly as the most formidable national competitor, it does not frame China as the enemy of our nation. And that is a really important distinction, because as I hinted at a little bit earlier, not only did the Trump administration regard China as a competitor, it in effect, regarded China as the mortal enemy of America. And this is a real departure from all previous policy of presidents and administrations of both parties, going back to Richard Nixon. No president has, up until Trump, has regarded China as the enemy of our nation, in effect. But if you look at the things that Trump said and the things that Secretary Pompeo and others said, there's no question that that was the framing. The Biden administration has pulled back from that very, very explicitly. And in fact, when the current Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, was testifying in his confirmation hearings, he listed Russia and North Korea and Iran as, in a sense, adversaries of the United States, but pointedly did not use the same term to describe China, but instead used the term competitor, drawing a very specific and clear distinction between Russia, North Korea, and Iran on the one hand, and China on the other. And a lot of other comments that have been made by the President, Secretary of State, and many others make it clear that there's a rejection of the notion that China is the enemy. That's a big difference. It's a semantic difference, but it's also a fundamental difference because it bears on policy. When you believe a country is an enemy, you prepare for eventualities that relate to enemies. And eventualities that relate to enemies essentially is war. I mean, an enemy is a country you fight wars with. A competitor is a country you compete with. And there is a big difference semantically, but there's a big difference in the policies you embrace if you frame countries in one or the other of those two ways. The second area of change is with respect to the area of reciprocity. Indeed, the Biden administration embraces the notion that we should seek reciprocity as a general rule, as I said earlier. But the difference is that the Biden administration doesn't seem to believe in reciprocity at all costs. It is engaging in something that it's a term I coined, that I call smart reciprocity, which is the idea of basically, and these are my words, but describing what I think is a more nuanced approach. It's the idea of let's seek reciprocity where it is actually in the United States' interest to have reciprocity. But let's not seek reciprocity where it's actually not in our interest to have reciprocity and where it doesn't comport with our laws, our international commitments, our values, our norms, our traditions, and our own sense for how we should conduct ourselves as a nation. And that is a big difference from the Trump administration. So reciprocity, yes, but reciprocity only where it serves our interests, not as a blanket tit-for-tat schoolyard playing in the sandbox. You steal my toy, I'm going to steal your toy. It's much more sophisticated than that type of a mindset. That's the second divergence. So reciprocity, yes. Smart reciprocity, yes. The third thing I would note is that whereas in the Trump administration, it was very clear through the many pronouncements of President Trump that the metric he was using, and therefore that the administration was using to assess the efficacy of U.S. foreign policy and U.S. policy toward China, was simple. Does this policy comport with Make America Great Again and America First, the chosen self-defined political ideologies and philosophies of President Trump. And the answer seemingly was, if this policy appears to comport with my own self-described vision for Make America Great Again, then let's enact it, whether or not it's good for America. And if it doesn't, then let's not. And that may, whereas and I'll give you an example of that in a second, but the Biden administration, I think, fundamentally calibrates and uses as a metric when it comes to assessing the efficacy of our policy toward China, national interests rather than fidelity to a particular political ideology. Now, what would I offer to you as a data point to substantiate the assertion that I just made? And I'm gonna say right here something that may need to be said. I am very old-fashioned, and I do believe that when you make an assertion, you should have a factual basis for that assertion. That's not something that we see too much of in this country anymore, but I have to say that's something that's important to me. So let me offer a piece of factual information to substantiate what I just said. So Donald Trump, as we all know, relied on the tool of tariffs. In fact, he referred to himself proudly in his own tweet as Tariff Man. That was what President Trump referred to himself as. And Tariff Man relied on tariffs to lower the deficit and to get China to change all its trade policies and so forth and so on. The idea of putting tariffs on incoming Chinese goods was comported with the Make America Great Again, America First, let's stick it to them, reciprocity at all costs. Their markets are close to us, let's shut our markets down to some degree to them. So it checked all the boxes, and so he did it. What was the actual impact of the tariffs? Well, I'll tell you what the impact was. They blew out the deficit. Donald Trump ended up with the highest average annual merchandise deficit with China of any president in American history, 17% above Barack Obama's average number, and 100% above George W. Bush's average number. And yet he regarded those as failed policies because the deficits were too large. He outperformed them by 17% as a result of the tariffs. 250,000 Americans put out of work. Tens of thousands of American factory workers put out of work. The U.S. trade deficit with the world reaching record levels, number 1, number 2, and number 3 in the history of the United States, dating back to 1776. He took the U.S. Agricultural surplus that we'd had with China for 25 years, and doing the unthinkable, turned it into a deficit for the first time in a generation. Something that no one even thought was possible. And this is the actual impact of the tariffs. Guess what? Every piece of data that I just cited is from the Trump administration. Every single piece of every number I gave you is from the Trump administration. They reported it on their way out in January and then later in February this year. So whether the tariffs serve the national interest, there's no question. They hurt America first, hurt America worst. No question about it. But they comported with the ideology, and therefore they're still on the books. Now I'll talk about the Biden administration's approach in a second, but what I want to say here is that the emphasis was on fidelity to an ideology, not to the national interest. Generally speaking, it is clear to me, for the most part, that the Biden administration wants to go to a more interest-based metric. Now that said, in fairness, it is also true that the Biden administration has not yet lifted those tariffs. It claims to be performing a top-to-bottom review of U.S. trade policy toward China. And I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt for about another couple of months. But if after a year in office they haven't lifted those job-killing, self-destructive, foolish tariffs that are putting Americans out of work, then they're going to be just as complicit in that foolishness as the preceding administration, and I'll be just as critical of them as I have been for 3.5 years of the Trump administration. But if they look at it and say, we realize that this is a bad thing for our country, and fix it, then that's a different story. And both Biden and Harris on their respective debate stages, both stated the tariffs are horrible for America and we know it and here's the data. And they were right. So now it's incumbent upon them as our leaders to do something about it. Last point that I'll make is that the style certainly of how we approach China rhetorically and diplomatically has changed a lot under this president. There is a rejection of the incendiary and frankly juvenile rhetoric that we heard over the last 4 years. I mean, we actually heard the President of the United States say the word Kung Flu. I mean, it's unthinkable to hear a US president speak the way a kindergartner might, in the sandbox. And President Biden, to his credit, on day one said that stops today. And so we haven't heard the over-the-top, crude, juvenile, and really shameful kind of language that we routinely heard over the previous 4 years. So rhetorically, there has been a big difference. And we've seen that in a lot of different ways. Stylistically, more generally, the United States, I think, is approaching China in a more business-like, mature, steady, and fairly predictable way. Whether or not one agrees with the underlying policies, it is fair to say they don't change minute to minute, and you don't have senior officials or even the president himself contradicting himself with his own tweet within 15 minutes, which happened on a number of occasions. During the course of the Trump presidency. So there is a difference in the way we're communicating, and I think that is to the positive. It doesn't change the fundamental dynamics or substance of the relationship, but it is a difference, and it is a welcome difference. Let me, before I end, just mention what I regard as the 7 issue clusters. I won't have time to go into them in detail, but we'll have Q&A in order to be able to do that. But I just want to say, there's never been a relationship between any two nations that has been as expansive and as wide-ranging and substantive as the United States-China relationship today. What China has done by adopting what is referred to as the National Security Law, that's the name of the law, that went on the books in June of 2020. What it's done is it's rolled back these freedoms. It's put democratic activists in jail, something that it hadn't done prior to that as a general rule. And now Hong Kong is not the place that it was from the standpoint of political expression. And the United States and many others in the world have a real problem with that, as do many people in Hong Kong. So that's an issue. That exploded onto the agenda in earnest really in June of 2020 and has been an agenda item since, certainly from a US standpoint. Let me also note, some of the issues that we in the United States think of as issues, the Chinese don't regard as being properly on the bilateral agenda. They don't accept that it is an issue in the relationship because they don't accept that the United States has any legitimate stake in the issue. And I understand that. But from an American vantage, this is a big issue. The second thing I would cite, again going back chronologically, is COVID-19. And by the way, I got special dispensation not to wear a mask while speaking, etc. So I asked about that, and I want to be respectful of all the rules, but Jim said that I could go without the mask. So I'm doing that right now, at a safe distance, I hope, from everybody. But COVID-19 was a huge, huge trust drainer in the U.S.-China relationship. And I've said publicly and said many times, including in the Chinese media, that China botched its early handling of COVID-19. No ifs, ands, or buts. They blew it. They made some significant and serious mistakes in the earliest response to the disease back in late 2019 and the first weeks of 2020. But that being said, a narrative took hold in the United States that somehow China had intentionally unleashed what Donald Trump called the China plague on America, on itself, and on America and on the world. And it's the CIA director at the time, Trump's CIA director at the time, said there's not one iota of evidence to support that assertion whatsoever. And yet this narrative took hold. And as a result, COVID-19 became a massive issue in the relationship. We all remember what the president had to say about it incessantly. And others, including members of Congress and others. And the bottom line is it actually drove down U.S. public sentiment toward China by 25 points in a real and enduring way. So whereas favorable sentiment toward China was at about 45% in January of 2020, it's at 20% today. And it was at 20% in April of last year as a direct result of COVID-19 and the repeated pounding home of a message, which I think is false, that somehow China had intentionally unleashed this, quote, plague upon us, when what had really happened is, like us, they botched their early response to it. And that's a problem, but that's a different problem. So COVID-19 is a big issue right now. Trade, third issue, I won't dwell on it. It remains unresolved. 3.5 years of tariffs have done quite literally absolutely nothing to change any Chinese behavior whatsoever. What it has done is thrown 250,000 Americans out of work, blown out our deficit, and so forth and so on. But it's done nothing to achieve its stated aims. And yet, on the other side of the equation, it is absolutely true that China engages in some really unfair trade practices that violate its commitments under WTO and various other things. That is true. It's wrong for China to do that. They've gamed the system in many different ways. There's a lot of legitimate frustration about that in America. And my hope would be, and still is, that we actually try to solve those problems rather than doing things that make matters worse. What I learned in public policy school was, number one, don't make things worse. And number two, don't come up with solutions that are actually worse than the problem. And those lessons didn't quite get through to some policymakers over the last 4 years. But trade is a big issue. There's a lot of different aspects to it, but probably the most fundamental aspect, arguably, is market access imbalance. It does exist. We need to fix it. And let's find a way to actually fix it rather than doing more harm to ourselves. So trade is the third issue. The fourth issue is technology. China aspires to be a technology superpower. It's a legitimate aspiration for any country. In the case of China, it's not only legitimate, but it's also a realistic aspiration because they have the prowess and the capacity to do it. We aspire to be a technology superpower. That is absolutely legitimate for us to aspire to. And because we're both aspiring to be number one, we are in a heated competition over the development of technology. From artificial intelligence to quantum physics to quantum computing to advanced robotics, automation, biosciences, and a whole host of other top-level areas of the 21st century and 22nd century economies. And there is a real competition going on between the United States and China. And that is one of the most contentious areas, actually, in the relationship. And along with some of the others, maybe one of the most intractable. The fifth area is military or security issues. Specifically, I would say there are two issues within this cluster that are major issues on the bilateral agenda today. One is Taiwan, and the other is the South China Sea, and to a lesser degree, in terms of a little bit more on the back burner, but still there, is the East China Sea territorial and maritime disputes. But the ones that are most active, if you will, are Taiwan, first and foremost, in the South China Sea. And I could go into this in Q&A, but the bottom line is that China has ambitions and aspirations relative to both Taiwan and its claims in the South China Sea that the United States has real problems with. And China has been exerting considerably more pressure in the case of Taiwan on Taiwan by launching record numbers of incursions into what Taiwan would regard as its air defense identification zone, or essentially airspace, including very recently, with hundreds and hundreds of warplanes literally going into Taiwan's airspace and creating a kind of symbolic intimidation. And obviously that's a serious matter. As recently as last week, President Biden stated something that is actually a departure from established U.S. policy, and that is that when asked by an interlocutor, I think a journalist, when asked whether the United States would defend Taiwan in the case of an attack by the mainland on Taiwan, President Biden said, yes, we will. We have to honor our commitment. The only problem with that is the United States doesn't have a commitment to do so. And so the White House, Jen Psaki, and others were walking back the statement and getting it back into alignment with the policy that's been in place for about 40 years, which is just shy, significantly shy of what President Biden articulated. But bottom line is that's a source of great tension. Last couple things, and I'll conclude. Influence operations, so-called influence operations. It's hard to say with a straight face for reasons I'll explain in a second. But there are some in this country that are concerned that China is engaging in a nefarious effort to influence American public opinion. I can't say it because U.S. public opinion toward China is at an all-time record low. It's at 20%. And yet there are people across Washington and elsewhere that are absolutely panicked that somehow China is making huge successes in gains in propagandizing the American people and making us buy into their narrative and think that China is great and so on and so forth. And they say that even as we have literally never in our history, in the history of measured public opinion, had lower favorable views in this country toward China. But there is a narrative that China is trying to nefariously influence our academic campuses, our discourse, and so on. Well, guess what? China is trying to inform and influence discourse in this country. And guess what else? We're trying to inform and influence discourse in China. It's what countries do. It's called public diplomacy. There's nothing unlawful about it. So many of you, I think, were in the Foreign Service as I was, or in diplomacy as I was. Public diplomacy is a legitimate activity of government. It occurs, and when you have the resources, it occurs on a decent scale. China's doing it. They used to be pretty inept at it. Now they're not. That's causing some heartburn in the United States. But as long as favorables are all-time record low, I wouldn't lose too much sleep over the notion that we're being propagandized and brainwashed by our friends in China. The final thing I would note is human rights. And I note that last, not because it's least important, but because it goes back probably the furthest, back into the 80s, and specifically really to 1989, but certainly throughout the early 90s and beyond. The United States has always taken issue, as a nation, we've taken issue with China's human rights practices. There's no question that China's human rights practices and human rights record is deplorable. There's no doubt about it. We know that. We've known that for many decades. And that's not an issue. But nevertheless, there have been recent developments, a number of the most significant of which occurred specifically on Donald Trump's watch, that have caused even greater levels of consternation and anger in the United States. One of them being China's actions in Xinjiang, in the northwest of China, and its rounding up of very large numbers of Uyghur Muslims into what China refers euphemistically to as vocational camps, camps that are surrounded by barbed wire that you don't get to leave of your own volition. And that's enormously problematic, and it shocks the conscience of the American people and many others across the world, and that's going on. It started 3 months after Donald Trump became president. And I'm not saying it's his fault, and it's not. But the fact that it happened on his watch suggests that the presumed toughness toward China, the idea that it was going to stop China from doing things that were problematic from an American perspective, is belied by that and virtually every other thing that happened in U.S.-China relations in the last several years. The other big one is the rolling back of democratic and expression freedoms in Hong Kong. So there are many other issues as well, but human rights remains a big issue. Let me conclude by just saying, there were some, I think, that were hoping that with the change in administration that occurred as a result of our election in November, that there would be some improvements, at least in terms of plucking the low-hanging fruit in the relationship, and that we would see an upward tick, at least to a modest degree, in the trajectory of the relationship. And I would say for the most part that has not materialized, at least so far. The tariffs are still on the books, which is really problematic and unfortunate for our country, but they're there. The consulate in Houston, Chinese consulate general in Houston, is still gone. Our consulate general in Chengdu in Sichuan, Southwest China, is still gone as a result. We lose on both accounts, and China loses on both accounts. The Fulbright program, which the Trump administration, President Trump specifically, shut down unilaterally, is still shut down. This leads to one of the great questions: who does that? Who shuts down the Fulbright program? I mean, it's unheard of, and yet that happened, and many other things as well. So a lot of us were hoping there might be some movement, not on the big issues, which would have been unrealistic to expect that in a short time frame, but at least on some of these other issues. Hasn't happened. So the relationship is still challenged. I think both China and the United States have contributed significantly in their own different ways to the stark deterioration of the relationship that we've seen over the last 5 years in particular. A lot of Chinese tend to think it's only the fault of the United States, and I disagree with that. It is also the fault of China for a number of the things that it's done and a number of ways that it's poured gasoline on the flames. But it is also true that we, the United States, bear significant responsibility as well. Because that is so, I think both sides have a responsibility to do what they can to get this relationship back on track, not because it's the warm and fuzzy thing to do, not because it's an altruistic thing to do, but because it's in the interests of both countries to have a relationship that is functional, constructive, results-oriented, mutually beneficial, and politically sustainable. That's a good thing for America. It's a good thing for China, it's a good thing for the Asia Pacific, and it's a good thing for the world. And we at the George H.W. Bush Foundation for U.S.-China Relations seek to advance that vision. And I'm so grateful for this opportunity, thanks to Jim and the Santa Fe Council on International Relations, to share these thoughts with you. Thank you so much.
I'm not sure if we can move this back, so maybe we'll stand.
Okay.
But before we open it up, David, we talked last night about what we might read in the Chinese press in English that would give us a better perception of China's politics and views toward America. If you might tell us that.
The Chinese press? Well, I think one of the things that you have to understand is that one of the trend lines that we've seen in China over the last 10 years, really dating back to President Xi Jinping becoming President, General Secretary, and overall top-level leader of the country, is that there has been a greater level of restrictiveness, an increasing level of restrictiveness around expression in China. It has always been quite restrictive in terms of the most sensitive issues. You can't have the type of open debate around fundamental issues, binary issues, yay or nay, in the way that we do in this country around every issue you can think of. Where it comes to Taiwan, where it comes to Hong Kong, where it comes to human rights or Xinjiang or leadership or China's system, there just isn't the room for the debate. So, there is some, that being said, I think if you look at some of the think tanks in China and what they produce, a lot of it's in Chinese, some of it's in English, there is some very thoughtful analysis that if you understand the context and understand how to read between the lines, you can often find some interesting thinking and some interesting ways of looking at issues and framing issues and some proposed ideas for how to get the relationship back on track. It's harder to find that kind of content in the state-controlled media, newspapers, and so on. To a large degree, the tonality of those kinds of publications will rise and fall with what's happening in the relationship at the moment. And so if you hear a set of incendiary comments from the United States, the next day you'll see a set of similarly incendiary comments, comparable comments, coming out of the state media, not from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, lectern necessarily, but from the media by way of kind of matching the tonality and keeping things at a symmetrical level. So, most of the best analysis that I've seen is produced by some of the best thinkers in the United States and Australia and elsewhere, folks who are thinking and writing in environments in which they can really lay out their thoughts in a way that is uncensored and that gets to the heart of the matter. And I could certainly share recommendations, but certainly Brookings produces some great reports, the Council on Foreign Relations, sometimes in congressional testimony, some of the experts that speak. There's a number of different things that I would point to, as well as books and various other articles. But to find that level of analysis in China, you have to know where to look and you have to recognize that it's a different context.
Susan, I'm worried that people may not be able to see if we sit down on this side. Is that true? No. So I'll sit down. Questions from you? Go ahead, sir.
Well, you talked about trade, but the flip side of trade is foreign direct investment.
Yeah.
And my buddies on Wall Street, there's a big debate going on. One debate is you invest in China because it's still a giant country, rising consumer middle class, great opportunity to make money. And on the flip side, there's no real rule of law, and the party is supreme, and you don't know what, like, they stop, video games stop for kids, all kinds of rules change for education. So the question is on which side do you come down? Is the party supreme, it's really a real problem with foreign direct or securities investment, or it's still a place to invest?
Well, I'll tell you where I come down personally, basically, in answer to your question, yes, invest. Yes, think about China as a country that is going to be immensely important in the global economy and to the American economy going forward as far as the eye can see, for decades and decades to come. It is also true that the party is supreme. There is no question about that. It is not a country in which the rule of law, as we understand the construct, governs. The party is absolutely rules the country and governs the country. And that is absolutely true. But it is also true that even within that political context, U.S. companies can and do successfully operate, make money, deliver value to their shareholders, and in many ways succeed. Could the market be more open? Absolutely, and I hope it will be. And I hope that our friends in China open their markets to something approximating the same degree that America's markets have historically been open to Chinese goods and services. And over the years, we have successfully exported as a nation more and more goods and services to China. The number was going up, and I think overall is still on an upward trend line. But there's room for improvement in terms of the Chinese policy landscape so that we can trade on a fairer playing field, a more level playing field. It's not as level as it could be, but the question I always ask audiences, and I'm going to go on a limb and guess that a few of you in this room have a 401k account and retirement accounts. Where was your account in 1971? And where is it in the year 2021? And if you think that investing in China and trading with China hasn't benefited our nation, then I would beg to differ. The extraordinary prosperity that's been generated in the United States to a significant, and I would say disproportionate degree, has been tethered to our ability to increasingly engage China economically and from a trade standpoint. Are there problems? Yes. Does China game the system and do some things that are problematic? Yes. Do we as a nation sometimes do anything that's problematic even in the trade area? Absolutely. The WTO ruled every one of the Trump tariffs from 2018 on to be illegal under the WTO, which they are, by the way. And we say that we adhere to the rules of the WTO, which we essentially created, and yet our own policies completely flout the international rules that we ask China to uphold. That being said, it was a tit-for-tat measure, as I explained earlier. But even with all of that, everyone has gained. And I want to say one other thing, and sorry for the long-winded answer, but I want to say one other thing. The notion that, I'm going to say something, the most controversial comment that I will make today, and I recognize that this is being videoed, etc., but I'll still make it anyway. I am pro-globalization, full stop, period. You know why? Because globalization makes the pie bigger for everybody. Globalization didn't fail. What failed was the domestic policy response to the prosperity that globalization in fact generated. And the problem was a domestic political problem where a significant swath of the population of many of the voting publics of many countries felt they weren't getting a fair shake. But it wasn't globalization's fault, it was a problem with domestic policy, and politicians not being sufficiently responsive to the needs of their constituents. Globalization did what it was supposed to do. It's still doing what it's supposed to do. Comparative advantage actually works. It makes the pie bigger. And the notion that we should get away from that or not invest or not go to the cheapest producer and so on is an economic fallacy that will lead to a reduction in our nation's prosperity. But then again, I believe in the market, not central planning. And so I think that's where we need to get back to. But yes, invest in China. And the last thing I'll say is this, and invest in America, and invest in any economy in any country and any company that you think is going to be prosperous. I mean, that's what it's all about. But I'll say this, every voice in Congress that has come out and said, let's decouple from China, China has stolen our jobs, China has taken manufacturing away from America. I challenge every member of Congress that's made those statements to show me their tax returns over the last 30 years. Because I want to know if those individuals have invested in Apple, in Dell, in Microsoft, in GM, in Starbucks, in all the other companies that have made a killing operating in China. Because if they've done that, then they're being very hypocritical. And I think we ought to know whether what they're saying matches what they've done.
Yes, sir, right over there.
Isn't the combination of autocracy and an aging demographic base China's key strategic weaknesses? And wouldn't a democratic, multi-party China be an even greater economic and security competitor to the United States than this neo-Maoism under Xi Jinping?
It's a great question. I don't think the answer is perhaps as simple as you might presume it is. I think that, first of all, I think China believes that it has found a model that can outperform our model. And that is exactly the combination of autocracy, which China is, with relatively enlightened economic management, which to greater or lesser degrees it has demonstrated that it has, and sometimes it backs away from the enlightened management views of the economy, and sometimes it's more open, sometimes it's more closed, sometimes it's more market-oriented, it seems to be moving back in a more state-oriented direction. But I think that China believes, the Chinese leadership believes, that the combination of political autocracy with enlightened economic management that gives some significant play to the market, but still allows for significant national initiatives and industrial policy that take the country in a direction consciously that it wants to go, that they think that recipe is a winning recipe. And would most Americans, probably all Americans, be happier if China were a Jeffersonian democracy? Sure, I think that's true. But I think the leadership of China believes that they have more room to maneuver by not having a Jeffersonian democracy and by being able to make the hard choices that, quite frankly, sometimes democracies can't make, i.e. infrastructure investment in our context and many other issues as well. And they feel that that combination of a strong central authority with some level of significant reliance on the market is a winning strategy. In a sense, it's the strategy that Singapore has used so effectively on a much tinier scale. But I don't think that China believes that being a democracy as we define the term would make things better and would make them a more effective competitor to the United States. You know, they look, if I may say so, they look at the United States and they see a country in which, according to Pew, the public opinion polling firm in our country, 70% of Republicans don't believe that Joe Biden was legitimately elected president. They look at a country in which 43% of Americans told Pew that they don't believe that Sandy Hook and Parkland actually occurred. They look at a country in which 34% of Americans told Pew a few months ago that they believe in all or a large part of QAnon. So China sees a country in which we've lost our mind. And they're going to take lessons from us about how to successfully compete against us. So the last thing I would say here is the gravest threat that we face in America today is the untethering of political and public policy discourse from factual reality. And unless and until we rectify that, we will never outcompete China, and we will never solve the problems on our national agenda. Because the problems are real, we've got to get real.
Ma'am, do you have a question? Okay, right over here.
Now, there were reports in the press this morning about China and Russia doing joint naval operations around Japan, which is not surprising, it's around Japan. But we don't hear much about China and Russian cooperation. Can you comment on the implications of that?
Yes, thank you. And I saw that report. You know, one of the things that's happened in recent years is that through the kind of the tough policies, quote unquote, that have been adopted, the very adversarial tone that we've embraced in our communications around China, both in the executive branch, the legislative branch, and so on, it's pushed China away, it's pushed the Chinese public away from us to a significant degree. It's actually galvanized Chinese support for its own leadership in a way that we hadn't seen in quite some time. And it has, to your question, catalyzed to a degree, a deepening of China's relations with other countries that it didn't necessarily have all that close relations with some years ago, Russia being a case in point. Do I worry about a so-called China-Russia axis or alliance, or that somehow we'll be facing both of them in World War III? I don't worry about it for a variety of reasons, but mainly because there are some real impediments to the long-term development of China-Russia relations. There's some tensions and issues there that are deep-seated. That being said, it is true that China and Russia are now collaborating to a degree that they weren't some years ago. And we have to think about that and be sure that we want to do what we're doing, because we have to recognize what we're doing will lead to certain other things. What it has led to, among other things, is China, feeling that it needs to work with other countries to counterbalance what it sees as an increasingly aggressive and adversarial United States. And these China-Russia exercises are a manifestation of that tendency. That being said, I don't go to bed at night worrying that somehow the two of those countries are going to gang up on the United States and so on and so forth. But we have to understand that to a large degree, when we choose to frame things in highly adversarial terms, these kinds of developments are going to occur. And by the way, let me also note that it was about a year ago that a major Western public opinion firm polled publics in 12 nations, 11 NATO allies of the United States and Japan. So 11 NATO Western democracy allies and Japan. In every one of the 12 countries, every single one, and this is on the record and you can look it up, Xi Jinping had higher favorables than Donald Trump in the publics of our NATO allies in Japan. Now, some would say, well, that was then, this is now, or that was affected by America's botched early handling of COVID-19. But the numbers are what they are. I mean, it's stunning that that would be so. My point being, we're driving China in different ways into the arms of others, and I don't think that's good for our nation.
I'm going to go to my interim boss, Ambassador Vicki Huddleston. Over here.
David, thank you. That was really a wonderful presentation. The part that I really focused on is the comparison of the Trump-Biden policies, which I find very discouraging. And it just isn't China, as you probably well know, because I care a lot about Cuba. Cuba is another one that falls in that ideological Trump-Biden zone. So I wanted to say two things in the question. It seems to me that the longer Biden waits, the harder it gets.
Yeah.
So there's those tariffs because of Taiwan, because of the Uyghurs, etc. It's the same thing on Cuba because the human rights doesn't get any better, right? So why? Why has Biden done it? I mean, is it the midterms? Is it 2024? Is it the Senate, Menendez? And who is behind the Biden-China policy?
Yeah, that's a great question, and thank you so much for asking that. So a couple of things. One, I agree completely with your analysis that the Band-Aid gets harder to pull off the longer that it sits there, and for exactly the reasons that you mentioned. China then does something else that we view as problematic, and then another thing, and then another thing. It would have been, in my judgment, the right thing to do from a policy standpoint and an American interest standpoint on day one, January 20th, to simply say, I hereby rescind all of the tariffs unilaterally, because doing that will actually help America, whether or not China does anything. If China doesn't remove its tariffs, it's hurting itself more than it's hurting us. But we're going to remove ours so that we can get people back to work and so on. And then, of course, China would reciprocate, and then you'd get back to where we were prior to 2018. That would have been easiest to do right at the outset, get it done, pull the Band-Aid off, and move on. And by the way, the entire business community is for that, and he could have gotten it done. I think it is harder now than it was. Why doesn't he do it? Joe Biden and Kamala Harris on their respective debate stages both said specifically, the tariffs are horrible for America. It's the Americans that are paying for them, which of course is true. And they were explicitly critical of this when they were candidates. Why hasn't the president acted upon that? And I think the answer is very simple. It's the politics of it. It's just, there's no desire or appetite in the White House politically, probably coming from President Biden himself, I would guess, to give an easy talking point to his political opponents and to allow himself to be portrayed as, quote, soft on China, weak on China, caving to the Chinese, bowing to his masters in Beijing, and all the stuff that you would hear from everybody that would take take advantage of that moment. And what we all understand, I think, in this room is that nobody knows the data in general. And nobody cares even when they know it. And we've gotten down this path of alternative facts in this nation so far down the path of that we've lost sight of facts and why facts matter in public policy discourse. And so anyone can come up here and say what I've said, that by every metric that we could possibly use, the tariffs are horrible for America. Everyone knows that. Nobody seems to care. And so I personally think that Biden looks at that and says, I don't gain much because I'm going to get hit with this. I'm going to get hit with it. Our party's going to get hit with it in the midterms. We're going to get hit with it hard for the 2024 election. And I don't want to spend political capital on it. I think it just boils down to that. But the difference between Biden and Trump is that Biden knows better. He understands that these are horrible for America. He understands that it's us that's paying for them. He actually knows that. He said it. Kamala Harris understands it. But in a sense, therefore, all the more shame on President Biden because he actually knows he is complicit in a failed policy that is horrible for our nation.
David, we'll have about 12 more minutes, so I'm going to ask you, with all due respect, to keep your answers to 2 to 3 minutes. And yes, ma'am.
So, will we do anything? What exactly do you expect she to do? And will we do anything? And whatever happened to one country, two systems?
Yeah, great questions. Okay, there's a couple of different things, and I'll try to be brief.
I think for Taiwan, you take 4 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. As a matter of declared doctrine, China believes that Taiwan is a part of China, and China wants to effect reunification with Taiwan by any means necessary, preferably by peaceful means, but if necessary by non-peaceful means. That is the declared and open position of China. Given that that is the position of China, the interesting question arises, well, why don't they take over Taiwan today? Why didn't they do it yesterday or the day before? And it boils down to, I think, an inarguable truth. And that is that if the Chinese leadership believed that the benefits of taking over Taiwan outweighed the costs, by definition, they would do it. And what I conclude from the fact that they haven't done it since, for decades and decades, since 1949, is that they don't think that the benefits outweigh the costs. It is the policy of the United States, and I'm using my words, but to bottom line the policy, it's the policy of the United States to have an approach to Taiwan that creates a sense in the mind of the leadership of China that the benefits are never going to outweigh the costs. And that's why we have something called strategic ambiguity, which is the formal name of the historical U.S. policy toward China, on the issue of Taiwan, which is the idea that even we don't know exactly what we would do in the event of a mainland assault on Taiwan. We don't know. No one knows. I don't know that President Biden himself right now knows what the United States would do. It is an open question, and it has been the purpose of that U.S. policy to create a question mark in the mind of the Chinese leadership that is sufficient to deter them from thinking that anything they do would be a slam dunk. So far, it's worked. In my judgment, we're not going to see, some would disagree with this, but so far I've been right for many, many years. And we'll see if I continue to be right. I think that for the indefinite and foreseeable future, the calculus in Beijing is going to be that the costs of taking over Taiwan will far outweigh the benefits of doing so. For that reason, they won't do it. That's why they've never done it since 1949. And I think the United States, broadly speaking, has the right policies in place, to say nothing of Taiwan's own defense capabilities, to create enough of a question mark to ensure that China doesn't believe that the benefits outweigh the costs. For that reason, though, there is a great deal of tension around Taiwan, and these incursions are worrisome, alarming, problematic. I think it's provocative and dangerous at a symbolic level. But in reality, it is bark, not bite. And I don't see the cross-strait situation conflagrating. And I don't see the United States and China coming to blows, or the mainland and Taiwan, and with the United States involvement, coming to blows over this issue anytime in the foreseeable future. Some people would say, David, I think you're wrong, we'll be at war in 6 years or 5 years. But I don't think we will be, for the reasons that I mentioned.